Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics, simplified your companion for exploring the fascinating world of law.
Hmm.
Today we're diving deep into a topic that's super relevant for all you aspiring lawyers in India,
Yes,
center-state legislative relations.
that's right. We'll be looking at how lawmaking power is split between the central government and the states.
Okay?
And trust me, it's way more interesting than it might sound at first.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. You're a lawyer in a country as vast and diverse as India.
Right.
Every case you handle could involve laws from both the center and the state.
Hmm.
It's like this legal puzzle where you need to know which pieces fit where.
Exactly. And that's why we're going to unpack a landmark judgment by the Supreme Court of India today.
Okay.
This case, State of Bombay versus R&D Chamar Bagwala, decided back in 1957,
Right.
really sets the stage for understanding how India's quasi-federal system works in practice.
Okay, hold on a second. Quasi-federal. What's that all about?
Hmm.
I always hear about India being a federal country, but quasi makes it sound like there's a twist.
You're spot on there, Ayas, a twist.
Okay.
It means India's federal structure isn't as clear-cut as, say, the United States.
Right.
The central government does have significant powers, more so than in a purely federal setup.
Got it. So it's like a hybrid system.
Yes.
But where does this whole newspaper and tax situation come into play?
Well, that's the heart of the Chamar Bagwala case. A newspaper printed in Bangalore was running a prize competition scheme.
Right.
You know those things where you solve a puzzle and win money?
Yeah.
And the Bombay government wanted to slap a tax on it, even though the newspaper was printed outside their state.
Hang on, that sounds messy. Could Bombay even DO that?
Yeah.
Isn't taxing usually a state matter?
That's exactly the question the Supreme Court had to grapple with.
Right.
And this is where things get really interesting for us law students because it all boils down to Article 246 of the Indian Constitution.
Okay, Article 246. I remember that from my constitutional law class.
Yes.
It's about how legislative powers are divided, right?
Right. Article 246 basically creates three lists of subjects: the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. It's like a blueprint for who gets to make laws about what.
So the union list is for the central government, the state list is for the states, and the concurrent list is where they both get a say.
You got it. Think of it like this defense is on the union list, so the central government calls the shots there.
Well,
Police is on the state list, so that's primarily a state responsibility.
right.
But then you have things like education, which is on the concurrent list.
Yeah.
Both the center and the states can make laws about it.
Now that you mention it, I remember those lists being a huge deal in class.
Yes.
But how on earth does that apply to a newspaper printed in Bangalore being taxed by Bombay?
Well, the Bombay government argued that their tax was about regulating betting and gambling, which falls under the state list.
Okay.
They said they weren't taxing the newspaper itself, just the prize competition scheme being run through it.
Clever argument, I'll give them that. So what did the Supreme Court say?
The court really dove deep into the nature of the prize competition.
Right.
They looked at whether it was purely a matter of chance, like a lottery, or if skill played a part.
Okay.
And guess what? They found that the scheme did involve some skill, which meant it wasn't strictly betting and gambling as defined by the state list.
Okay, so Bombay's argument didn't hold water because the competition wasn't just a pure gamble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The court said that Bombay was essentially trying to regulate something that fell outside their defined powers.
Right.
And this is where the concept of pith and substance comes in.
Okay.
It means you have to look at the true nature of a law, its core purpose,
Uh-huh.
to figure out which list it falls under.
I'm starting to see how this case is so important. It's not just about a newspaper and a tax.
Yeah.
It's about setting the ground rules for how we interpret those lists in Article 246.
Right.
It's like the Supreme Court gave us a legal compass for navigating this whole center-state lawmaking maze.
You nailed it. The Chamar Bagwala case shows that the lists in Article 246 aren't always black and white.
Right.
Sometimes there's overlap,
Okay.
and the courts have to determine which level of government truly has the power to legislate on a particular matter.
This is making me think about all those times in class when we debated whether the center or the states should have more power. This case really throws light on how the Constitution tries to strike a balance, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it showcases that balance in action. But remember, this is just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
We also need to understand what happens when central and state laws clash directly.
You mean when they both try to regulate the same thing,
Yes.
but in different ways? That sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It can be, which is why we have the doctrine of repugnancy to help us sort things out. But we'll delve into that fascinating concept later.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
All right, so we've talked about how Article 246 divides up legislative powers,
Yes.
and how the Chamar-Bagwala case showed us how to figure out what a law is really about. But what happens when a central law and a state law actually bump heads on the same topic?
That's where the doctrine of repugnancy comes into play.
Repugnancy.
Imagine a situation where Parliament, using its power under the concurrent list,
Okay.
passes a law about environmental protection with certain standards. But a state government wanting to boost industrial growth passes its own law.
Right.
That sets lower environmental standards.
Whoa, that sounds like a classic tug-of-war.
Yeah.
So how does repugnancy help us figure out which law wins?
Repugnancy basically means that if a state law clashes directly with a central law on the same subject,
Yeah.
and it's impossible to obey both,
Right.
the central law prevails. Think of it like this Parliament's law sets the baseline,
Okay.
and any state law that goes against that baseline gets trumped.
This is making me think about all those environmental cases we hear about.
Yeah.
Like when a state government tries to loosen regulations, but activists argue it goes against national environmental laws.
Yeah.
Is that a repugnancy situation?
It definitely could be. Those are exactly the kind of scenarios where repugnancy comes into play.
Okay.
Lawyers would need to analyze both the central and state laws to see if they truly clash,
Right.
and if one tries to override the other's intent.
So it's not just about whether two laws are slightly different, it's about whether they fundamentally contradict each other.
Exactly. There has to be a real conflict, not just a difference in detail.
Right.
But here's the thing. The courts will try their best to harmonize the laws. They'll try to see if there's a way to interpret them so they can both coexist.
That makes sense. After all, a legal system where laws are constantly clashing wouldn't be very effective.
Right?
But what if those efforts at harmonization fail?
Mm.
What if the laws are just irreconcilable?
That's when the hammer of repugnancy falls,
Okay.
and the central law prevails. It's based on the idea that Parliament representing the whole of India
Right.
has a broader perspective on matters of national importance.
Okay, so far we've seen how Article 246 divides powers
Yes.
and how repugnancy steps in when there's a conflict. But are there any situations where this center can make laws about stuff that's normally on the state list? I mean, those lists seem pretty clear-cut.
You're bringing up a really important point, and it highlights how the Constitution balances those clear-cut lists
Okay.
with flexibility for exceptional circumstances.
Okay.
Enter Article 250.
Article 250, that rings a bell. I have a feeling this is about those emergency situations we briefly touched upon.
You're right on the money. Article 250 gives the Parliament the power to make laws on NOI subject listed in the state list.
Wow.
But only when a national emergency is declared. It's like a constitutional safety valve.
So if there's a war, a natural disaster, or some other major crisis, the center can step in and make laws that would normally be off limits.
Exactly. Think about it. During a national emergency, swift and unified action is crucial.
Right.
The central government might need to take charge of resources, coordinate relief efforts, or even impose temporary restrictions for the sake of national security.
This has given me a whole new level of respect for how the Constitution works.
Yeah.
It's like it anticipated those what-if moments and built in mechanisms to handle them. But wouldn't this emergency power give the center too much control? What's stopping them from abusing it?
That's a valid concern, and the Constitution doesn't ignore it.
Okay.
Firstly, declaring a national emergency is a big deal.
Right.
It has to follow a specific procedure laid down in the Constitution,
Yeah.
and it's subject to parliamentary oversight.
So it's not like the Prime Minister can just snap their fingers and declare an emergency.
Yeah.
There are checks and balances in place.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And secondly, the laws made by Parliament under Article 250 are temporary. They only remain in effect during the emergency.
Right.
And for a short period afterward, once the emergency is over, those laws become ineffective,
Right.
and the states regain their usual legislative powers on those subjects.
It's like a temporary shift in power to handle a crisis, not a permanent takeover.
Yeah.
That makes me feel a lot better about the whole thing.
And here's another point to consider. Even during an emergency, the central government doesn't have a free pass to do whatever it wants.
Right.
The laws they make are still subject to judicial review.
So the courts can step in and say, hold on, this law goes too far, even if it was passed during an emergency.
Precisely. The Constitution ensures that even in extraordinary circumstances, the rule of law prevails. As aspiring lawyers, you'll be dealing with situations where you have to analyze the interplay of central and state laws,
Right.
especially during emergencies. It's crucial to understand how these exceptions function and the limits placed on them.
Wow. This whole discussion is making me realize that center-state relations are a lot more complex
Yes.
and a lot more fascinating than I ever imagined. We've talked about lawmaking,
Right.
but what about the actual doing stuff part? How do the center and the states work together to put laws into action?
That's a great question, and it brings us to the administrative side of the equation.
Okay.
Think of it as the practical nuts and bolts of running a country as diverse and vast as India.
Okay, so we're moving from the world of laws on paper to the world of laws in action. This sounds like it's going to get really interesting. All right, so we've covered how laws are made, how conflicts are resolved, and even how the center can step in during emergencies. But what about the day-to-day business of governing?
Yeah.
How do the center and states actually cooperate to make things happen on the ground?
That's where Articles 256 to 263 of the Constitution come into play. They provide the framework for administrative relations between the center and states. Think of it as a set of rules and mechanisms
Okay.
to ensure smooth coordination and prevent things from descending into chaos.
Okay, so it's like the instruction manual for how the central government and state governments interact on a practical level. Can
Exactly.
you give us some specific examples of how these articles work in real life?
Absolutely. Take Article 256, for instance. It empowers the Union to give directions to the states
Okay.
to ensure that laws made by Parliament are properly implemented. Think about a nationwide policy on, say, public health or education. The center might issue directions to the states on how to implement those policies within their territories.
Because it's not just about passing a law in Delhi and expecting it to magically work everywhere.
Right,
The center actually has a way to make sure states are on board and following through.
exactly. And it goes beyond just giving orders. Article 263 allows for the establishment of interstate councils to foster collaboration and resolve disputes. These councils act as platforms for dialogue and negotiation between the center and states.
That sounds like a much more constructive approach than everyone just arguing with each other.
Yes.
So these councils are where the center and states can sit down, hash out their differences, and find ways to work together.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that in a country as diverse as India, a one-size-fits-all approach rarely works. These councils provide a space
Right.
for states to voice their concerns, share best practices, and work together to find solutions that benefit everyone.
This is giving me a much clearer picture of how the whole system functions. We've got the legislative side, the judicial oversight, and now this administrative framework for cooperation.
Right.
But is there any particular area where these administrative relations become super crucial, like a real make-or-break issue?
There definitely is, and it's something that directly impacts millions of people across India. Water. Article 262 specifically addresses interstate water disputes,
Oh, wow. Water disputes.
which in a country with diverse river systems and varying water needs can get pretty intense.
I remember reading about those in the news states arguing over who gets how much water from a shared river. It sounds like a legal battleground.
It can be. Water is essential for everything, agriculture, industry, even basic survival.
Right.
So when states have conflicting claims on a water source, things can get heated. That's why Article 262 is so important.
Okay.
It empowers Parliament to create tribunals specifically to adjudicate these disputes.
So it's like having a dedicated legal referee for water wars. And these tribunals have the power to decide how much water each state gets, taking into account everyone's needs and ensuring fairness.
You got it. These tribunals are designed to resolve water disputes in a way that is legally sound, equitable, and hopefully prevents these conflicts from escalating into something bigger.
This entire deep dive has been an eye-opener.
Yes.
We've gone from the theoretical division of powers to real-world scenarios like that newspaper tax case, the potential for conflicts between central and state laws, the safeguards during emergencies, and now the crucial role of administrative cooperation, especially when it comes to something as vital as water.
It's been a fantastic journey through the intricacies of India's quasi-federal system. And what's truly remarkable is how this system, despite its complexities, has allowed India to function as a unified nation while accommodating its incredible diversity.
And for all our aspiring lawyers out there, understanding these complexities is essential.
Absolutely.
You'll be dealing with these principles every day, whether you're working on corporate deals, environmental issues, criminal cases, or even family matters.
Absolutely. Remember, law isn't just about memorizing articles and precedents. It's about understanding the spirit of the Constitution, its delicate balancing act between the center and states,
Hmm.
and how these principles translate into real-world situations that impact people's lives.
I love that takeaway.
Hmm.
It's like a call to action for all of us to think deeply about the law, its nuances, and its impact on society. This has been an incredible deep dive into center-state relations in India,
It has.
and I hope our listeners have found it as insightful and engaging as I have.
I second that. It's been a pleasure exploring these concepts with you.
Thank you for listening to LexTalks. Follow, subscribe, and stay notified to never miss an episode.